Hello and welcome to Bible Gone Wild. This is the podcast that tells stories from the Bible that others won't tell, and many don't want you to hear. Because these Bible stories feature sex, violence, or are just plain weird. These wild stories vividly describe the darker side of human nature, so they are often graphic and disturbing. I will be telling them with all the gory details, so consider yourself warned. Today's episode is entitled, When God Kills. Wait, what? God kills, but isn't killing against the rules? Doesn't it say in the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill? Why would God kill someone? Two fellows who might have asked the same question were Uzzah and Onan. And though they lived hundreds of years apart, they had one thing in common. Both of them pissed off God, and so he killed them. In our first story, God strikes down Uzzah for touching something he should not have touched. And no, it wasn't his ding-dong. Next, we'll hear the story of God killing a man named Onan for spilling something. But to be fair, it was something really important. We'll get into the question of why God would kill someone he was mad at in a bit. But before we get into that, let's go ahead and hear the story of Uzzah, a good guy whose only fault was he made one really fatal decision. Unfortunately, the Bible doesn't tell us much about Uzzah. All we really know about him is that he, along with his brother Ahio, were given the great honor of transporting the Ark of the Covenant from a town whose name I can't pronounce to Jerusalem, 9 miles away. This was all taking place when King David was king of Israel. You remember David and Goliath? Yeah, that guy. One of King David's ambitions was to build a temple in the capital city, Jerusalem, where his people could make sacrifices and worship God. Well, you can't have a temple without having the Ark of the Covenant, so David asked for the Ark to be brought to Jerusalem. Okay, so I've mentioned Uzzah, our unfortunate victim, who will get zapped by God in just a minute or two, but really he's not the focus of this story, and neither is God for that matter, or King David. The story of Uzzah is actually just a little footnote in the greater story of the Ark of the Covenant. Some of you may be wondering, what is the Ark of the Covenant? Well, if you're asking this, then clearly you have not seen Raiders of the Lost Ark. Shame on you. Go and rent it and watch it immediately. Those of us who have seen Raiders know that the Ark is an ornate wooden box covered in gold. That's what an Ark is. It's a chest or a box, but Box of the Covenant doesn't sound nearly as impressive as Ark of the Covenant. On the lid of the box are sculptures of 2 cherubim or angels, and in the box Moses put the 2 tablets on which God himself had written the 10 Commandments. Okay, here's a bonus question. What other 2 items does the Ark contain? I know, it's a head-scratcher. The answer is the Ark also contained a jar of manna, the food God provided to the Israelites in the desert, and the staff of Aaron. Aaron was Moses' brother, and he was the first high priest of Israel. So, if you've seen Raiders, you know what the Ark is supposed to look like, and you also know it is one powerful box. But I'm afraid we're going to need a little more of the Ark's backstory if we're going to understand and appreciate the story of God killing this good old boy named Uzzah. Fortunately for us, the story of the Ark has plenty of violence and weirdness surrounding it, so it definitely is our kind of Bible story. The Ark of the Covenant is the most important relic of the Hebrew people, which is why David wanted it for the temple he was planning. But the Ark, as we will see, is so much more than a mere relic. It overflowed with God's presence and God's power, so much so that it could even be hazardous to the Hebrew people who built it. As Indiana Jones and the melty-faced Nazis find out at the end of Raiders, the Ark isn't just a symbol of God's power, it is a conduit of God's power and God's presence. Here's an example that Indiana Jones himself mentions briefly in the movie. The Bible says that when the Israelites carried the Ark before them into battle, they could not be defeated. In our last episode, we heard the story about how the Israelites marched the Ark around the city of Jericho 7 times. It caused the ancient city's walls to come tumbling down so that the army could go in killing man and woman, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkey. So, for obvious reasons, when it came to the ark, the Israelite army didn't like leaving home without it. Okay, then why didn't they carry it into battle all the time and never get defeated? Fortunately, answering that question will lead us right to the story of Uzzah. Apparently, the Israelites played the "let's use the ark to win the battle" card one too many times. It seems that the army of Israel had lost a battle where I guess they had forgotten to bring the ark, so someone said, well, let's go back, we'll get the ark, and then we'll show these Philistines a thing or two. But apparently God didn't like the ark being used as a secret weapon, because the Israelites lost the second battle too, and, gasp, the Philistines captured the ark.
When I sleep, I wanna weep. She's burdened by the time. She longs for all her younger years. She's so pretty and sublime. The moving finger writes, but doesn't wait for her.
Who were the Philistines, you may ask? Well, they were neighbors of Israel, and for 400 or 500 years, they were their archenemy, with almost a constant state of war existing between the two nations. The most famous Philistine of all was, of course, Goliath, the giant killed by David. The Philistines play a role as bad guys in many of the books of the Bible, including Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles. So, as principal villains, they are an important group in the Bible. So the fact that the Philistines now had the ark was astonishingly bad news. What if they burned it, or smashed it, or even worse? Well, no worries there. The Philistines knew the ark was a sacred item, and they respected that, so they put it in one of their pagan temples. And that's when some weird stuff started to happen. First, they put the ark in the temple of Dagon, who is one of the many gods the Philistines worshipped. In some depictions, he's shown to be a fish god or an ocean god or something, which means he's either depicted as having a fish tail for legs, like the Little Mermaid, or he's shown with regular human legs but wearing this great fish hat. It looks like what you might wear to the baseball game if your team's mascot was a fish. So the ark is left there in the temple of Dagon, where there's a statue of Dagon standing tall with, I like to believe, his cool fish hat on his head. But when the Philistines came back the next day, the statue of their god was lying face down as if bowing before the ark. Weird, the Philistines thought. And they put old Dagon back up, but the next day he was down again, and this time his hands and his head were broken off. This freaked everyone out enough to want to move the ark to a new town. Someone said, let's give the ark to the Philistines over in the town of Ashdod. Hey, you guys want a big golden box? You bet, send it over. But once the people of Ashdod had the ark, a plague broke out, and it was a plague of, wait for it, hemorrhoids. That's right, a lovely plague of hemorrhoids, and if that's not bad enough, a plague of mice also poured out over the land. It didn't take the people of Ashdod long to figure out that they were being cursed, so they passed the ark on to the next Philistine town of Gath. Surprise, surprise, more plagues break out. Then the ark is given to the town of Ekron, where the people started getting terrible boils all over their bodies. Finally, after 7 months of this, the Philistines had had enough. They knew what they needed to do to get their lives back to normal. They had to get the ark back to where it was before, with the Israelites. So they asked their priests and diviners what they should do. The priests told them, put the ark in a cart and hitch the cart up to a couple of milk cows and put the calves of these cows away in a pen somewhere. If the cows overcome their need to nurse these calves and instead they take the ark back to the Israelites, then we will know that it's the Israelites' God that is pissed off at us and he's the one that's cursing us. Oh yeah. One more thing. You're also going to want to include a kind of my bad payment to appease their god. So send them an offering of gold. Okay, gold coins? No, not gold coins. Okay, then gold bars? No gold bars. You need to send them 5 golden hemorrhoids. I beg your pardon? Yeah, make a gold representation of the hemorrhoids and boils, the plague you just suffered from. Make one for each of the 5 Philistine kingdoms, and make a bunch of golden mice, one for every walled city and village, so, a bunch of those. So the Philistines do what their diviners suggest. And with golden hemorrhoids and mice aboard, the ark finally makes it back to the Israelites. And the Philistines, who are watching from afar, are happy because, no more hemorrhoids. And the Israelites are happy because the ark is back. The only people who are unhappy are the Hebrew men of Beth Shemesh, who make the stupid mistake of looking inside the ark, and so, zap, 70 of them are killed by God. But eventually the ark makes it to the home of Abinadab, who would keep the ark for 20 years or so, and Abinadab was the great-grandfather of Uzzah, who is about to get zapped by God. Wow, that is a lot of backstory. Well, when King David wanted the ark moved from the town whose name I can't pronounce to Jerusalem, it was Uzzah and his brother Ahio who loaded the ark up into a cart pulled by oxen. So Uzzah and Ahio no doubt were carrying their ox goads. Remember the pointy sticks from episode 1? No? Okay. Off they went then, on a painfully slow trip to Jerusalem. As Uzzah and Ahio move the ark to Jerusalem, they're not by themselves. This is such an important event that King David himself is present, and some priests, and some scribes, and 30,000 soldiers, and musicians playing, and I like to think, dancers too. King David, you see, knew how to make religion fun. And this is a great example of his willingness to find fun even in the most mundane activities, like transporting an ark. He turned the trip to Jerusalem into a mobile religious festival, and it sounded like people were having a great time. Everything is going smoothly, until they pass a threshing floor. So you should know that threshing floors were considered sacred in many ancient religions. We'll talk about this in a later episode because in the Bible, there are some naughty things that happen on threshing floors. So the cart is passing by this threshing floor when the oxen stumbles, and Uzzah instinctively grabs the ark to make sure it doesn't fall. And the scriptures are very clear on what happens next. The Lord's anger burned against Uzzah, and he struck him down because he had put his hand on the ark. So Uzzah died there before God. I remember hearing this story as a child and thinking, that's not fair. I mean, this guy was just trying to keep the ark from falling. King David must have felt the same way. He was like, what the hell? Why did God do that? And the scriptures say that David is now angry with God, and even gives the place a name that I guess is supposed to reflect his anger, but it seems to just mean the place where Uzzah was broken, or something like that. I think we can understand David's anger. First, it's clear Uzzah was just trying to do the right thing by grabbing the ark, and it was probably just a reflex action, and he certainly wasn't intending any disrespect to God or to the ark. So there's that. But I'm sure David was also mad because his awesome party had now ground to a halt. There is simply nothing that puts a damper on a party faster than God smiting someone. It must have been a huge bummer. No more music, no more dancing, no more fun. Plus, everyone must have been a little freaked out at having been reminded that this shiny box was dangerously powerful. David was so freaked out, he canceled the whole operation and sent the ark to the home of a priest named Obed-Edom, who must have been thinking, oh goody, I get to keep the ark that kills people. Yay! Actually, things turned out pretty well for this priest. I guess he and his family kept their hands to themselves because there were no deaths, and in fact, the family was blessed by the presence of the ark. But Uzzah was not so fortunate. He was gone because for the briefest moment, Uzzah forgot the first rule of the Ark of the Covenant, which is no touching. Before we get on with the story of Onan, let's talk about this question of how God could kill if killing is a sin. Remember, one of the 10 Commandments is, "Thou shalt not kill." Well, we quickly learn in the Bible that even for us humans, there are a bunch of exceptions to this commandment. For instance, no one who ever heard this commandment for the first time, or really who's heard it since, thought it was intended to mean, "Thou shalt not kill animals." So the commandment really is, "Thou shalt not kill people." What's that, you say? You really want to kill a person? Well, don't give up hope. In the Bible, there are still plenty of exceptions to this "thou shalt not kill humans" rule. For instance, has the person you wanted to kill committed any of the 30-plus crimes punishable by death, such as persistent disobedience to parents, or kidnapping, blasphemy, or any number of crimes revolving around consensual or non-consensual sex? If you can get your nemesis convicted of any one of these crimes, you may be allowed to kill him using one of the 4 acceptable ways of carrying out the death penalty according to the law of Moses, which are stoning, burning, decapitation, or strangulation. By the way, you know your list of ways to die is crappy when decapitation is the best choice. Of course, if the guy you want to kill is in an opposing army, then you don't have to worry. You're going to get lots of chances and lots of encouragement to kill that guy. You may also kill if the person in question's living on some land you believe God wants you to have. In the Bible, conquest is an acceptable reason to kill. But wait, let's be fair. That's not just true in the Bible, that's true of the whole ancient world. Conquest was universally seen as a valid excuse to do all sorts of nasty things, including killing people. But if we're tempted to be critical of those ancient folks for all the people they killed taking over new lands, we do need to remember that killing for reasons of conquest was never more widely, successfully, or prolifically practiced than in the last couple of centuries, so let's not be too hard on those ancient folk, okay? Alright, so if we humans get exceptions to the "thou shalt not kill" rule, then surely God should be given the same leeway, and we shouldn't be too shocked when we hear about God going all Dirty Harry on some poor guy. And it's true. You really don't have to look far in the Bible to find a scripture about God striking people down. Unfortunately, there are so many times when God is involved in the death of a person or a group of people. We had to narrow our focus a bit for today's episode, so for today we set aside all the times when God instructs someone else to kill on his behalf. Someone like, the army of Israel, the armies of the enemies of Israel, a bear, a lion, the angel of death, Satan, or a good old-fashioned plague or natural disaster. All of these will kill on God's orders at one time or another in the Bible. It's not that these times when God instructs others to kill are unimportant. Someone or something killing on God's behalf is going to drive a lot of the narrative of the Bible. In fact, the angel of death killing the firstborn in Egypt will become one of the most important moments in the history of the Bible, an occasion that's remembered during the Passover festival, a celebration that's extremely important in the Old and the New Testament and in the Jewish and Christian religions. Today, I'm focusing on the verses where God himself does the killing. The times when someone's going along with his day, something happens, and whammo, he's struck down. Alive one minute, dead the next, and when we look around, we find it's God who's holding the smoking gun. We've already heard the story of Uzzah. Now let's hear about Onan, a fella who tried to have his cake and eat it too.
I can see the look upon your face, all the questions you're asking. I can see the look upon your face, all this time is moving past me.
For the story of Onan, we need to go much further back in time. Before King David, before the judges, before the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt, we're going all the way back to the time of the so-called patriarchs. Abraham, Abraham's son Isaac, and Isaac's son Jacob. Now, Jacob had 12 sons, whose descendants became the 12 tribes of Israel, and one of Jacob's 12 sons was Judah. And from his descendants come the kings of Israel, so yeah, his story is pretty darn important. Judah had 3 sons. And at the beginning of this story, we hear that his oldest son had done something naughty, and God had killed him. Unfortunately, those are all the details that we are given. The oldest brother, who had been killed by God, had a wife named Tamar. According to custom, the brother of the deceased was supposed to marry his dead brother's widow. This was kind of creepy, but it was a way to make sure the widows were supported, and it also protects the line of the oldest son. So Onan was supposed to marry his dead brother's wife, Tamar. But that's not all. He was expected to get her pregnant, too. And if she had a boy, that boy would be considered his dead brother's son. So the new baby would end up inheriting more wealth than Onan would. So the long and the short of it is, having this child is going to cost Onan a pile of money. But he's absolutely obligated to go through with the marriage and to do his marital duties as a husband. What to do, what to do. I know, he says, when I'm with Tamar, I'll just pull out when I start to get that tingly feeling and spill my little soldiers on the ground. I think it's absolutely hilarious that Onan didn't just say, I'll have sex with her, but I won't have an orgasm. I mean, that's not even mentioned in the story. It's not even an option. Who would do that? That would be crazy. Or maybe that was his original plan, but he got a little more excited than he thought, and he had to go to plan B. Whatever. The Bible does say that it is not a one-time thing. He did this every time he had sex with Tamar. Well, that was all she wrote for Onan. The Bible says, what Onan did was evil in the sight of the Lord, and he, God, put him, Onan, to death. Here 1 minute, gone the next. God's not going to kill anyone else in this story, but I've got to keep going and tell you what happened to Tamar. It's too good to pass up, plus it has a little weird sex that I don't want you to miss. So at this point in the story, Tamar has married 2 brothers. Both brothers were personally killed by God himself. So guess what, Tamar? Nobody's going to marry you, honey, not in a million years. Which sucks for Tamar, because if you think there's a lot of pressure today to get married, it's nothing compared to the pressure put on women in ancient times. Back then, women who couldn't get married and couldn't have a baby, many times because their husbands were impotent or infertile, these women were considered cursed. Having children was the one way a woman could find security and some control over their lives. But even if Tamar found someone who wanted to marry her, yeah, good luck with that, Tamar's father-in-law, Judah, wouldn't allow her to be married, and this went on for years. In the course of time, Judah's wife died, and Tamar saw an opportunity to have children that she knew would bring her status and power. So she hatched a plan to seduce her father-in-law. One day Tamar found out where Judah was going, and she got there first, and with a veil on her face, she pretended to be a prostitute. Judah took one look at her and said, "Okay, what do you charge?" And Judah most definitely didn't spill his seed, because this little trick resulted in Tamar becoming pregnant with twins. When the whole story came out, Judah accepted these twins as his heirs, and it's from one of these twins that would come the line of the kings of Israel. And then a little bonus for Tamar, the story ends with the note that Judah didn't have sex with Tamar again. Because, having sex with your daughter-in-law is okay when she's disguised as a prostitute, but otherwise it's just icky. It's amazing that God himself killing 2 brothers isn't the most interesting part of this story.
Oh, baby, please admit it. It's your imagination. This ain't no realization.
Okay, here's a question. Why are these stories about God killing people in the Bible? Well, I think it's safe to say that these stories are meant to get our attention. They're telling us that there's something important going on here. In the story of Onan and Tamar, we're reminded that God has taken a special interest in this family. God has plans for them to multiply and to become a great nation, and that's just not going to happen if the fellows aren't willing to ejaculate inside their wives. Unfortunately, church leaders throughout the ages have missed the point of this story and instead have interpreted it to mean that masturbation is sinful. Come on. Onan didn't get zapped because he was masturbating. It was because he was selfishly messing with God's plan to turn this family into a nation. So the message here is simple. Don't mess with God's plan. But what about this poor fellow Uzzah, who's just doing his best to keep the ark from falling out of a cart? I mean, they really go out of their way in this story to make Uzzah sympathetic. Why did God kill Uzzah? Once again, something important is going on here. The fact that God kills Uzzah, this sympathetic character, tells us that, but there's also the fact that this story is told twice in the Bible, in the book of 1 Samuel, and then again in the book of 1 Chronicles. And you know, if the teacher mentions it twice, it is going to be on the test. Well, I think the lesson here is pretty straightforward. The story of Uzzah reminds all those who hear it of a life lesson we all have to learn. There are some rules you can fudge on, because there seems to be a lot of wiggle room. Strangely, according to the Bible, thou shalt not kill is one of these. But there are some rules you have to follow to the letter or pay some major consequences, like, I guess, touching the Ark of the Covenant. Apparently there is no wiggle room in that one at all. King David must have learned this lesson because the next time they tried to bring the ark to Jerusalem, he put the priests in charge of moving it. But David still had a good time, because the Bible says that as the ark entered Jerusalem, David was leading the procession and he was leaping and dancing. In an interesting aside, it said that David's wife looked out of her window in the palace and saw him there, leaping and dancing in front of this procession, and as she looked down at him, she said, "What an asshole." No, it doesn't say that. It says she despised him in her heart. So, not a happy marriage, I guess. So the story of Uzzah reminds us that there are some rules you just don't break, and it also reminds us that the ark is powerful. It represents the presence of God, and it plays an absolutely central role in the religious life of the people of Israel for hundreds of years, until it's captured or hidden in the Babylonian conquest of 587 BC. Until that time, the ark is going to spend hundreds of years inside Solomon's temple in the inner room called the Holy of Holies, the central room in the temple. And with the ark there, the room becomes the dwelling place of God on earth, with the ark serving as God's throne on earth. The story of Uzzah is a not-so-subtle reminder that the ark is powerful. So remember, if you ever see the ark, look with your eyes, not with your hands. Today we end with a brief story that involves one of the only things stranger than God killing someone, and that's God trying to kill someone and failing. This happened to Moses just after he encountered God at the burning bush. God had instructed Moses to go to Egypt, and Moses was doing it. He was on his way with his wife Zipporah and their firstborn son. Then, out of the blue, God shows up there in the wilderness and tries to kill Moses. As God and Moses are struggling, somehow Zipporah, Moses' wife, knows just what to do. She grabs a piece of sharp flint, and in the middle of God trying to kill her husband, she circumcises their son with the flint. Not a job you typically want to rush. She takes her son's bloody foreskin, and then she wipes it on Moses' feet, and this, for some reason, causes God to step off. There are a lot of different explanations for what's going on here, and I could go on about the theories various Bible scholars have, but instead, here's what I think. At the burning bush, we readers of the Bible, along with Moses, learn a lot about God, including his name, Yahweh, which is huge. So maybe this story is a reminder that even though we have learned a lot about God, we don't know everything. God's nature remains a mystery, and so do a lot of God's actions and motivations. Hey, it's just a thought. Well, that's all for today. I hope you'll join me for our next episode when we will be looking at a few stories from the Bible concerning rape. And yes, these are stories that are sad and disturbing on many levels. But despite that, and maybe because of it, I think these are stories that we need to hear. So I hope you'll join me for our next episode. Our theme music is from the song Parasite by Lamprey. Other music in today's episode is from the group Pachyderm from their self-titled LP. If you want more information on this podcast, you can find it at Bible Gone Wild on Twitter and at BibleGoneWild.com, where you'll find show notes for each episode. There's also a Bible Gone Wild Patreon page if you'd like to throw a few shekels my way. I hope you'll join me next time for stories from the Bible about rape. But until then, don't forget, from time to time we all need to go a little wild.